So welcome. I'm Andrew Fanning, Research and Data Analysis Lead at Doughnut Economics Action Lab. Thank you so much for joining this session, which is part of the amazing lineup of events and sessions that have been taking place on this very first Global Doughnut Day. So my day began at 8:30 in the morning, dialing into Melbourne, and here we are 12 hours later for me, and still very much going strong. So as I said, I'd like to take full advantage of our brief time together to offer a wide-ranging discussion together with Timothée Parrique on the role of economic growth in the transformation needed to secure a thriving future for humanity and the rest of the living world, or in shorthand, living in the donut. And so I'm, as I said, joined by Timothée Parrique, an ecological economist based at the Lund University in Sweden. So Tim has thought deeply about degrowth. He is the author of Ralentir ou Périr, l'économie de la décroissance, a book based on his PhD thesis, The Political Economy of Degrowth. You can find him active on his blog, on social media, and other outlets discussing so-called green growth and decoupling, which are concepts we will open up further in a moment. So welcome, Timothée. And I'm excited.
Hello, everyone. So excited to be here.
I'm just probably too excited for this conversation because Tim and I have been in touch quite a few times over the past few years by email, on Twitter, as speakers at online events, but we've never actually really had a chance to have a one-to-one. And of course, this isn't exactly an intimate because we now have, I'm not sure how many people who have joined us here in the room, but hey, maybe just this once, I think this is a case where more may actually be better. But I thought I would start us off by setting the scene a little bit, and I'd like to try to get a sense as well of how people here see the likelihood of different GDP pathways before we dive into a conversation with Timothée. And let me start by, we're not going to do the poll quite just yet though, because I'm going to set the scene a little bit. So let me start with the Global Doughnut, which was created by my colleague Kate Rayworth, which is the reason why we have all been brought together here on this day, which shows a world dangerously out of balance. So where billions of people are not meeting their most essential needs for food, education, political voice, and more, and yet humanity's collective level of resource use is placing this massive pressure on our planetary home. We're overshooting multiple planetary boundaries for climate change, biodiversity. This image is actually from 2017, which has since been updated and showing, unfortunately, even more challenging performance ecologically, which tells us really that the current system needs to be fundamentally transformed so that we can come into the donut from both sides at the same time, really. And our economic system wasn't designed for this challenge. So we need new policies and new models and new metrics that are fit for these troubled times. But if we actually want to apply these new policies and models and metrics for specific places, then it becomes clear that this global picture is missing some very important context, because humanity, of course, is not a single entity. There are vast inequalities of lived experiences, both within and between countries. And one way to unpack and make visible these differences is by comparing country performance with respect to the donut across as many indicators and countries as possible. And this is one of the things that we did in a recent study that covers nearly 150 countries. So here's a set of countries plotted by the overall extent of ecological overshoot compared to the overall extent of social shortfall. And we want to be in that green area in the top left, where no country currently is, where we're meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. But as we all know, of course, these nations are not living totally separate realities. We need to remember their stories are deeply interconnected through history and through power, through a history of colonialism and military and corporate power, current relations of debt and trade rules that are skewed in favor of the global north, through ongoing destruction of ecosystems, extraction of resources, and the impacts of climate change, which are overwhelmingly driven by overconsumption of the richest, and yet their impacts are felt first and hardest by the most vulnerable. And so if we take this picture, and we try to plot a trajectory across countries here, it pretty much tells the story of the history of economic growth, of GDP growth, that increasing production and consumption, material-intensive resource use to create goods and services, that will achieve our problems, which is kind of the story of economic growth of the 20th century. And it does do that at first, but then, of course, the problem is then we swoosh right past. So there is an urgent need to reimagine what it means to achieve human prosperity in the 21st century with a new vision. So how can low-income countries like Kenya or Malawi rise up towards getting into the donut without shooting right past? So that'd be a pathway that has never been taken before. And likewise, how can middle-income and emerging economies like China or Turkey, how could they pursue a new vision that reorients their economies just 90 degrees away from the growth-based trajectory? That too has never been traveled before. And then let's think of the high-income countries, like in the European Union or Canada, where I was born, or the United States. They too need a lot of ambition and even more humility, I would argue, to undertake an unprecedented transformation, to meet the needs of all their people while massively reducing resource use to come back within fair shares of planetary boundaries. That too has never been done before. And of course, we need to rebalance this unjust international system that we have inherited. That means taking responsibilities and making reparations, so redistributing wealth extracted unjustly through colonialism or disproportionate appropriation of the global commons. And of course, there's much more that could be rebalanced, unjust debts, redesigning international financial institutions, rebalancing voice in global governance, and more. But if we zoom in on these reduced countries, the richest nations that the world has ever seen, in terms of economic activity at least, then I think that we can acknowledge in many narratives, there's been an alignment on this goal that we do need to reduce resource use to come back within planetary boundaries. But of course, whether you read green growth or post-growth or degrowth, there is this coalescing around this goal. But of course, what we have are very different visions of what will happen to GDP, economic activity, as resource use is reduced. And of course, nobody actually fully can have complete conviction on those future trajectories. So what we can do is look at the evidence and present alternative visions. So let's take a closer look. We can explain, take a look at these two lines where you have GDP and resource use going over time. Let's say we're at around 2020, where historically they have been very tightly coupled. Maybe over the last decade or so, we've been witnessing some decoupling of resource use, which could be CO2 emissions, where we see the most, or in some cases, some material use or energy use, and so on. So we see this point. And of course, the question is, what is the likely GDP pathway for high-income nations aiming for the donut from here? So I'm going to show a range of different GDP pathways where, again, we can think of this path to come back within planetary boundaries as that's a requisite. That's where we're all agreed where we need to get to. So what is GDP going to do? Do you think that we can have continual GDP growth where we just keep growing up on our way as resource use declines? Do you think that GDP will come to a kind of stationary state where we're not growing anymore as resource use declines? Do you think that we will all organize a planned reduction in resource use that will in all likelihood be accompanied by a planned reduction in GDP before stabilizing, as many degrowth proponents advocate? Or do you think all of this is naive and actually what's going to happen is we're going to continue to pursue growth, it's going to fail, and we're going to induce collapse? So at this point, I would invite you to take a stand on which of these four options do you think is more likely? And if we can cue the poll at this point, I'm really, really interested to see what's going to come out of this conversation. So let's just take a few minutes, well, a few moments to see what are the viewpoints in the room? And just to state, this is, of course, anonymous and not a representative sample at all. You will not be held to this viewpoint. Please do share your current thoughts on what is the most likely pathway that you think right now. All right, I'm seeing, I think pretty much everyone has voted. So let's take a look. Let's take a look at the results here. What do we have? Can we see the results? Can people see the results? I'm not sure. Leo, you want to give me a thumbs up? No, you can't? Oh, shoot. How about now? Yes? Okay, sorry, technology is making an appearance right now. But I think if you can see the results, what do we have? So first thing to notice, actually lots of different views in the room. And I think that it's worthwhile to recognize, and maybe we're not always so prepared to make space for this type of thing. So continual GDP growth, I'm seeing 15%. Equivalent levels on stationary state and degrowth around 17% each, and 50% of the room, so half of the room, believing at this moment in time that a collapse is the most likely pathway. So that is, I mean, a lot of the diversity in the room that we should make space for. I guess what it also illustrates to me is that there's some huge uncertainty in this room as well, because, you know, if we think about it, 15% going for continual GDP growth, that would be 85% of the people do not have the conviction that pursuing continual growth is going to be the pathway to come back within planetary boundaries. And that, to me, that really raises an ethical question of how we should act in the face of this uncertainty, because a precautionary approach would argue that we should assume the worst, right? Which to me suggests that we fundamentally need to change course and move away from this dependence on continual growth that is baked into our institutions and our policies. They're effectively constrained to offer options that only pursue this continual growth option. So I think that there's been a whole lot of people who've been thinking about how to remove this structural dependence on growth, which brings us maybe to the next point where we can speak to Timothée and hear some thoughts. So let me stop sharing there and jump into the next part. Thanks so much for that. So, Timothée, let's get to it.
Fantastic.
So you have been busy. Congratulations on your book. Congratulations. It really seems to have struck a chord in the French-speaking world. I've seen you've been, very, very active with podcasts and events and on your blog and so many things. So, I mean, I guess just to start off, can you tell us about your origin story? I found so many ecological economists, including myself. We can point to a moment where we've been bitten by a radioactive spider, or choosing the red pill in the Matrix, where everything changes.
My superhero story. It's quite embarrassing but it's the truth. So I used to be a very arrogant neoclassical economist. Like when I went to study a bachelor at university, they gave me mainstream economics, and I took it. And I was this kind of very annoying Gary Becker style economist that was trying to just prove everyone's wrong. Like, you're a sociologist, you're a philosopher, you're a client. Like, I'm going to show you economics is just the best. And third year, they send me for an exchange in Sweden, and I take my first course in sustainability science. And I'm like, climate change, what is that? Small economic problem. Let me show you the power of economics. And then I realized that the power of economics is not a superpower at all. I realized it was actually more like a cognitive disability. I'm like, I'm not equipped to think about that. And so for me, that was a big I've been spending 2.5 years investing into an analytical framework that is actually just closer to LARPing than, something actually useful to explain the world. So I came back with a lot of humility and be like, okay, how do I equip myself? And the first thing I stumbled upon was Herman Daly's work. And Peter Victor has been writing a book. I think the title is Herman Daly's Economics for a Full World, which I can recommend, and Herman Daly's work overall. And I think the first book I read from him was the book from the 1990s, like the Economics of Sustainable Development. And I was blown away. Like for me, that was my restart. I restarted from ground one and was like, okay, Tim, now, okay, I've got 3 years of economics behind me. I need to restart again from these new foundation. And that's actually when I fell in love with economics, when I started to understand that economics was much more exciting when you re-embed the economy in nature.
That's great. Well, I mean, in my case, it was 6 years in. So you're already doing better. So I was 6 years into a formal economics, just mainstream education, until I had the privilege of discovering Herman Daly and ecological economics. So you're already doing better than me there. So the title of this session, though, it's From GDP Growth to Thriving in the Doughnut. So I guess it's worth briefly discussing the first part, right? Like I know you've thought a lot, what's wrong with GDP growth as a macroeconomic goal?
I mean, I've got this 3-step argument that I like to use. So the first one, what's wrong is that it's biophysically unsustainable. And to be more precise, we should say the pursuit of economic growth in high-income country. So over decades and decades, let's say the endless pursuit of growth that never ends, always end up hitting some kind of ecological boundaries. And that's the debate you've been mentioning between, can we decouple GDP from environmental pressures and grow forever in a dematerialized, world, or can we not? I think, following the theoretical foundation of ecological economics and more empirical work, studying that actually existing decoupling, I maintain that somehow, there is no infinite growth on a finite planet. So we are back to Kenneth Boulding in the 60s and Nicolas Georgescu-Roegen and Herman Daly. So that's the first biophysical limits to growth. But then I've developed 2 other steps to be like, what, even in a world with infinite resources and with the bulletproof ecosystems that never degrade, then economic growth, or again, the infinite pursuit of economic growth, will hit another limit, a social limit that has to do with another limit that we don't talk about, that has been very well studied by feminist economists since at least since the 1990s, which is what some people call temporal capital. Let's just call it time in general. A day is 24 hours. If you spend, more hours within one paid job, it means you will spend less hours doing something else. Before, economists thought that whatever is not paid is not, part of economics, and so we don't care. But now we realize that these so-called reproductive activities, they are essential to what we call the monetary economy today, in the same way that energy, materials, and ecosystems are absolutely essential to the economy. So if you, let's say, boost economic growth by trying to build McDonald's everywhere, and we all each take 1, 2, 3, 4 jobs, and we work 80 hours a week, then no one is writing Wikipedia article, no one is organizing, volunteer associations, no one is raising kids, no one is helping each other. And so society can reach a state of social recession. So that's the second limits to growth. And then there's a third one. That is my favorite. Imagine we have no biophysical limits to growth, no social limits to growth. But then what is the point of growing your economy if it's not raising standards of living? And I think that's the one you showed very well in your paper. Some countries manage to just increase their GDP without increasing the quality of life, or even while decreasing their quality of life. There was this paper which was called Wasted GDP in the USA that just came out by Morton Tonneson, and he's comparing the US as a case of what he called wasted GDP, because he's calculating that 27%, in between 27 and I think almost 40% of US GDP is actually wasted because it was not completely decorrelated from indicators of quality of life. And so in that perspective, if you have GDP growth that is not creating quality jobs, that is not reducing inequality, that is not eradicating poverty, that is not just increasing the quality of public services, and that is not just raising levels of well-being, why the hell are we just growing the economy for? So for me, that's kind of the ultimate, is just touching on like the raison d'être of economic growth in the first place. And when you put these three limits together, I think you get yourself a pretty good critique of economic growth.
I think that's a very compelling case. That's great. So one of the things, I guess, working on from there, like one of the things that you have dedicated a lot of energy towards is in, and that I respect, I think it's a great service actually, is in responding to people who advocate kind of environmental policies that are, you know, claiming to reconcile economic growth with, you know, sustainable outcomes, or so-called degrowth, without acknowledging, you know, the risks of that position. And such pieces, which I really enjoyed, I wrote and jotted down when I saw it the first time, you've called a kind of macroeconomic greenwashing.
Yeah.
And these pieces just seem to come out with this exhausting regularity on some very big platforms, and that it's hard to keep up. So a couple examples to get your blood boiling if you want to get angry. So I remember we went back and forth earlier in the year when the economist Paul Krugman had a piece published in the New York Times saying, wonking out why growth can be green. And of course, The Economist, that wonderful magazine, had a piece after the Beyond Growth conference in May of this year titled "Meet the Lefty Europeans Who Want to Shrink the Economy." And of course, these are go out and make some claims. So can you share some responses to typical arguments put forward by green growth advocates?
Yeah, and before saying that, the good news is that I see less and less of them. So I've been doing several years of hardcore, like vigilante work of just going out there debunking green growth. And I was actually amazed how poor these arguments are. I mean, imagine me writing a response to Paul Krugman. I mean, every molecule of my body was shaking. I was like, or I also debated Alessio Terzi. Is an economist working at the European Commission at the growth department. Is going to eat me alive, and I end up debating these people and realize they have nothing in the bag. The argument is hocus pocus. Like, it's really, and I've been to the bottom of this because I spent a huge chunk of my day actually just dissecting their argument, looking at their numbers, like checking their theories. And I can tell you, like, it's like an Ocean 11, except there is no one protecting, the casino. It's like you're just this very often, like, someone is bringing you the evidence or an argument arguing for green growth, and then you're just first starting by like, okay, what are you measuring? And very often you realize they don't take into account imported environmental impacts. So it's very easy to tell the story of how Europe has gradually dematerialized without looking at all the pollutive industries we've been exporting to the global south. Right now, we're starting to have better footprint indicators or consumption-based indicators where we take this imported impact into account, and that tells a different story. So that's the first step. And then that step is like end of the discussion. I've never debated someone that went over that step. The second step is to be like, guys, secret. An ecological transition requires more than just a reduction of greenhouse gases. You tell this to Paul Krugman, it's like, brain is exploding. They're like, what? I really thought it was just a carbon problem. It's not. I mean, planetary boundaries, plural. It's in the name. So we need to talk about water. We need to talk about soil, biodiversity, biomass, metals, minerals, all kind of pollution and waste and e-waste and, acidification of oceans and a lot of different stuff. Even if you were right now to phase out completely your carbon footprint, you would not be you would not be sustainable by the concept of sustainability we're using. So if some countries, and I'll get back to a study as an example, have shown that, greenhouse gases are decreasing. Okay, cool. That's like showing me you've done a diet and you're showing me your arm. And you're like, look, my arm is slightly thinner than last year. I'm like, yeah, Tim, but you need to lose 20 kilos. So what about your legs? What about the rest of your body? So show me evidence of countries or theories that manage to explain how you can shrink the total ecological footprint, meaning getting back within planetary boundaries, so decreasing everything, all the red stuff you've shown, while growing your economy. That's the challenge for green growthers. No one is doing that. 99% of green growth arguments focus on carbon. Then, okay, let's say hypothetically someone is going to manage to get past that gate. What's the final boss? Then, okay, the final boss is to talk about the speed and order of magnitude. You showed it very well. Planetary boundaries, they are boundaries. They're thresholds. So again, if you're doing a diet and you're losing a gram per year, your doctor is going to laugh at you, being like, Tim, don't be a smart ass. Like, you need to lose 20 kilos, not so. Don't call this absolute decoupling if your emissions are just losing, 1% a year. What we need is to get back within planetary boundaries fast enough, or should I say, as fast as possible, for equity issues, meaning to liberate as much natural resources to plan for the development of global South countries that have internal donut problems. And so when you take that in, and here I'm mentioning a paper from Yefim Bogle and Jason Hickel that is called Is Green Growth Happening? Where they pick, the kind of front runners, the countries that have experienced absolute decoupling of GDP growth and greenhouse gases. There are 11 in the world. Those are the Usain Bolt of kind of like decarbonizing their growth. And they look at their average speed and they ask themselves, okay, how faster, is that sufficient? Is that fast enough? The answer is no. Actually, they would need to be 10 times faster, because at their current pace, it would take an average of 20 to 120 years for them to reach near climate neutrality. So the diet is not fast enough, even in the countries that have started a decade ago and are going as fast as possible. So assuming, like expecting every country right now to be able to do that, every country, let's say every high-income countries, to reach 10 times the speed would be like assuming every human being starting tomorrow is going to run, 10 times as fast as Usain Bolt. Like, I mean, maybe it's theoretically possible. I don't know, but it seems a bit foolish. So I think when you get to that, through that, and we could go even, faster. Blair Fix was writing in the blog Economics from the top down, wonderful economist. I mean, in one of his books has been laying a very interesting theoretical demonstration on the impossibility of decoupling based on the fact that you can decouple GDP from greenhouse gases. Let's say you ditch fossil fuels, but you cannot decouple GDP from energy use or material use. Because, I mean, can you think of a single economic activity that is not using energy, materials, or mobilizing some kind of ecosystem services? I can't.
Yeah, exactly. So it's almost convenient to focus on carbon because there, low carbon alternatives exist, and it requires that we don't need to fundamentally transform. So almost these arguments are just propping up business as usual in a sense, but we do need to transform. So let's talk about degrowth. So I must confess, one pet peeve of mine is when I see people calling for degrowth as if that's the goal. But of course, that's just as incoherent as calling for economic growth as a goal. And I've seen you and many other ecological economists, when you dive into the literature, of course, nobody's calling for degrowth as a goal. The goal is, a desirable destination where it has different names. It's a post-growth economy, a sustainable steady state, well-being economies, living in the donut. They all share this common goal of meeting the needs of all people within the means of the living planet. So can you explain, though, how you define degrowth as a trajectory and post-growth as the destination?
Yeah, so that's really the main argument I make in my book, Slow Down or Perish. So I define degrowth as downscaling of production and consumption, plan to reduce ecological footprints, plan democratically in a way that is equitable and for the sake of improving well-being. So I've got that descriptive bit, downscaling of production and consumption, and then I add the full values of sustainability, democracy, justice, and well-being. So it's not any contraction, it's really a specific contraction that will be selective enough to lower ecological footprint in a way that is democratic, just, and convivial. But we understand that just like when you do a diet, you don't stop eating everything forever, right? It's temporary, it leads to somewhere. Here, one of the main goals we've seen is to get back within planetary boundaries. And, if we want to plan it smartly so we don't get back within planetary boundaries by sacrificing, internal kind of social minima, or sacrificing these social minima for some people, a portion of the population. So that's why a degrowth transition is a bit more tricky to organize than just contracting GDP, which you can do very easily, like during a financial meltdown or some kind of collapse. So I've got this definition in 5 points, and in the book, in my French book, I've built a symmetrical definition for post-growth, which I define as a steady state economy in harmony with nature, where decisions are democratic, where wealth is equitably shared in order to be able to prosper without growth. So we have still the 4 values of sustainability, democracy, equity, and well-being, even though they're phrased differently. You see, during the transition, the goal is to lower ecological footprints. That's what we focus on. But over the long term, that's not really a societal model. But living within the donut, you could say, or just being in harmony with nature, or sustainable economy, that's a long-term goal. Same thing, like when you shrink the economy, part of an ecological transition, and you have to have social safety nets and be careful about employment, inequality, inflation, all these kind of stuff. That's during the diet. But over the very long term, the goal is to have this kind of flourishing, to have, I mean, what Tim Jackson's called like prosperity without growth. So you want your economy to keep evolving and to be resilient and to be agile, not only during a transition, but in the way it functions. So that's, yeah, the way I articulate the two. If you want to do very short, I mean, I often talk about like degrowth towards a steady state, as you described. And I mean, that was already something, I think that was one of the major outcome of the 2010 International Degrowth Conference, where back then there was, little conceptual fights between American ecological economists around like Ehrman Daly and kind of European political ecologists. And they were like, oh, is that degrowth or is it a steady state? And I realized, actually it's degrowth towards a steady state. In the same way that there's been this mad fight between eco-socialists and degrowthers, like since 2002, since both concepts were born the same year, eco-socialism and décroissance. And now very recently, they've reconciled each other to say like, I mean, the goal is like these kind of eco-socialist degrowth. So a transition informed by the principles and values of eco-socialisms towards an eco-socialist economy, which again, here you can fit with many different words. I think that's what's interesting now, is that we have this overview, this kind of toolbox view, where we have different instruments for the transition and different utopias for the destination. And that's really where like the project has been gaining in wealth. And I think that's why it's getting more popular, and that it's more modular. Depending on the context you're in, you can choose different concepts and you have different instruments and visions available to move forward.
That's great. And that really jives with one of our approaches at Doughnut Economics Action Lab, is trying to not so much focus on the donut as a concept that we want to be, promoting as a one-size-fits-all thing. What we've been trying to do is create these kind of tools of concepts that can be picked up in different scenarios, as you say, like for a different utopia, different contexts, and that can be adapted and that are available, in a toolbox that anyone can pick up and share. And I think it's quite important, actually, the step of sharing back, because we think that, the act of sharing back, the reciprocity, is just one thing that can be so inspiring to others who see, someone like themselves who is doing that thing that they never thought of, or they didn't think to do in that way, or it sparked an idea of how they could apply it in their context. So that's really, that's a really core piece of ours, what we call peer-to-peer inspiration. But it seems clear to me, I guess, just to wrap up on, and then I think we'll have a bit of time for some questions, that seems clear to me, at least, that over the past couple years, 5 years, that post-growth narratives are becoming seemingly more popular. And, there's been polls, there's, the ideas have been getting refined. And if we go with, that famous quote attributed to Gandhi, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. I'd say we seem to be flickering between the laughing and the fighting stages. But I think a key part of the fighting stage, right, like it lies in defending the ideas that we communicate from misuse, from getting co-opted. And as post-growth narratives increase in popularity, I think it increases that risk that they get captured or co-opted by powerful interests that are entrenched in the growth-based status quo. And for us at Doughnut Economics Action Lab and the community of Doughnut economics practitioners, we are put a lot of effort into asking how do we ensure that these ideas can be made open and available and that they spread at the speed and scale that's needed, while also protecting their integrity and their transformative potential. So we've been trying to build a shared community around principles and setting clear guidelines and boundaries for how different actors can engage with Doughnut economics. But, you know, have you come across examples of degrowth or post-growth kind of greenwashing? And any ideas on how, you know, as this field shifts, like how do we safeguard these concepts so that they do scale with integrity?
I mean, I've been in a situation now in France, so the concept of post-growth is exploding in interest, especially from companies. So they're all very interested to be like, how do we become a post-growth company? And then I always kind of remind them of like, guys, you know, it's a bit like you have to go through the degrowth phase first, because, you know, the whole problem is that we cannot be sustainable at the current scale. So we need to go through the shrinking phase, and then we can thrive, you know, within planetary boundaries. But because it's very easy to already project yourself in this well-being economy, this kind of post-growth world where, you know, value is just satisfying needs and partly disconnected from all the problem we have. But it's much more difficult to face all the transition obstacles we have today. So it's not really greenwashing. It's, let's say, people that are picking the easy part of the Rubik's cubes, you know, like they're asking you to give them a Rubik's cube where there's only 3 moves left to be made and they can put it on the shelf. I'm like, no, like the Rubik's cubes right now is completely messed up, you know. So we need to start from the beginning. Degrowth has not been, I've never seen a cooptation of degrowth for the fact that the word has been hated so intensely since the beginning. Like it's like a very toxic little snail, and so all the other actors, you know, I've never dared eating it because they're like, it's just so repulsive. We're not touching this. And I think degrowth has tied itself theoretically quite strongly to other concepts around like you know, Marxist critiques of capitalism, a very strong anthropological critique of utilitarianism, feminist political ecology, and so a bundle of very counter ideological concept that's just you know, it's so when you start using degrowth, you cannot just pick the part you like, being like, I'm just going to use the kind of circular economy bit, thank you, you know, the rest I'm not going to take. Like, it's not possible. Like, it doesn't work analytically, so you cannot cut that from the rest. So I think right now we're enlarging the spectrum, which is fantastic. We're creating many middle steps in between kind of radical, hardcore European degrowth, you know, in full force, and many middle ground, which is good because before there was just like the step was too big to jump from today, like growth-based imperial global capitalism, to just like this world, which is too much. So we need a lot of intermediary steps. But we constantly need to remind people that that's a long journey, and we cannot self-congratulate ourselves by just, you know, every time we do something, like a company has managed to, you know, to reduce greenhouse gases for, you know, a tiny bit, and they're like, cool, we're now part of this kind of like green dematerialized economy. I'm like, not yet, unfortunately.
Yeah, I hear you. That's, I guess, particularly when it comes to companies, because those national donuts that I showed, and we've done a lot of work with cities and with subnational work and indicators. So looking at, you know, selecting targets, selecting indicators, how are you performing socially and ecologically? How do we take into account, you know, local aspirations and global responsibilities and those footprint methods and all that? But with business, actually, we've been quite careful, quite strict in terms of how businesses engage with Doughnut economics. And one of the reasons is because of the imagery, the iconic nature of the donut. It's just very attractive to some, you know, big name corporations that could just like eat the donut up for breakfast. So what we've been focusing on is really the design of those businesses themselves. So we ask, what's your purpose? How are you networked? How are you governed? Who makes decisions? How are you owned? And how does that ownership then drive the finance that is, expecting returns from investing in this activity? And all of those questions, of course, are going into the heart, I would argue, of kind of the very, as you said, hardcore kind of anti-capitalist or feminist or other types of narratives, but actually doing so in a way that is able to open up a space for discussion. I guess that's what we've been trying to do, is to open up without polarizing, without making people shut down and just say, no, that's crazy, that didn't work, that's socialist, that's whatever. So but it's a tough thing, for sure. Well, I could just keep this up for quite a long time, although as I mentioned, I am 12 hours into Global Donut Day, but I can handle another 12 more hours at this pace.
You deserve some rest.
No, I can rest tomorrow. But why don't we open up? Let's open up to some questions. So we have some things in the chat box. Do you want to kind of go back and forth here together? I'll ask you the first one. If we open up the Q&A box, I'm just going to quickly scan some questions. So Juliette Goulet, sorry if I mispronounced, when discussing degrowth, I'm often told that I am delusional or unrealistic, that it would require such a collaborative effort from many countries, institutions, governments, that it will never happen. And it's better to go for green growth because it reduces slightly our impact. What do you respond to that? So what are the first steps to make it happen? Great question.
The first thing to say is that growth does not happen naturally. Growth is the result of a tremendous, extremely complex, sophisticated organization. So imagine high-income countries needs to maintain some kind of geopolitical order so that the global south export to them almost for free their natural resources that they need, just so that we can increase levels of production and consumption. And this is extremely difficult to organize. Compared to that, an economy that focuses on the concrete needs, that prioritizes sectors that are very, happiness intensive, and that kind of, produce locally. I mean, all of that seems easier to organize in a very pragmatic fashion. If we come back to this kind of core social and biophysical limits to growth, I think a post-growth economy is just easier, more realistic to organize.
I think that yes, if you look at the machinery at the global scale, I certainly agree. So Luis Palicio asks, are there any local or regional examples where degrowth has been put in place? And I can say that with Doughnut Economics, as of right now, there are more than 70 local governments who are kind of picking up the concept and playing with it in some way, whether indicator-based or to inform their decision-making, or different approaches. For degrowth, have you come across any examples?
No, I haven't. And I think that would be, those two could be like, they're two different steps of the same process. Like imagine a city like Brussels or Amsterdam, or all the cities that have started using the donuts, and they do this, and then they realize a certain contradiction in their model of development. They're like, okay, we want to get back within planetary boundaries, but we're not managing while just growing. And so therefore they will have to think of degrowth strategies and come up with a lot of different instruments. And I think cities and companies and sectors have been doing that, but for different things. So certain cities have been trying to reduce over tourism, and certain cities have been trying to get rid of cars. I mean, I'm thinking of Amsterdam, for example, like over decades have been trying to degrow the number of cars in the street. Now what we have to do is to think of the synergies between, construction and diets and cars, and do this in a concerted effort. So I think that'll be next step. I do hope from actors starting to use the donut and realizing that, yeah, after that, a certain diet will be necessary.
And I think there's very much, at least in my experience, there's very much an alignment in terms of the ideas that, and rather than the terms that are used in and of themselves, in some cases, degrowth is really gaining a lot of interest and energy, and it inspires a bunch of people to kind of take on this anti-capitalist and the like very clear almost conflict-based approach. Whereas for some other people, that word kind of turns them off in a different way. But actually we can be, you know, I wouldn't say turns them off conceptually, but turns them off just in their particular context. It's just like, well, we're not going to use that. So maybe we talk about, you know, well-being economies or this, or use a different word to actually mean the same thing. So is there, Eric Meyer, and yeah, we have a little bit of time. So, oh, it just disappeared. Eric Meyer, is there any work on how the planning of that reduction in ecological footprint can look like? So I've seen a couple of actors starting work on this, but just as a starting point, not a widespread discussion. So how would the planning of a reduction in total ecological footprint look like?
Well, that's a good question. The way I've been looking at it for the case of France is we have a very sophisticated water planning in France. So we have 12 water basins, each have like what we call a water parliament, and there's general water plans. And I've been looking at what happens when you have water scarcity. So last summer we've had massive water scarcity. And how do you do to organize the water economy, let's say, to satisfy water needs when you have 50% of the water that you actually need? So you have to prioritize. And how do you prioritize? You know, so you have to have rationing protocols. And so I think organizing like a decrease of total ecological footprint would look a bit like this. Like for each indicator, you would just identify what's the footprint now, what is the biocapacity? So how much of a shrink do we need to do? Then second, you would look at like all the activities that require this resource. And then you would ask yourself, you know, make a list of from the most important for collective well-being to the least important. And then that tells you, which we already do. We do it when we do monetary rationing. If your income is divided by half or more because you lose your jobs, you know, you're not going to stop feeding yourself. You would start stopping other things. Same thing for a company when there's got a reduction in revenues, same thing for a city. So now imagine at the level of the economy, we'll have to do this, except we're not following a monetary constraint. We're following something a bit trickier, which is a biophysical constraint. So it's not a single number in euro, it's different numbers in liters of water, in tons of carbons, in ton of biomass, in number of species, in square meters of soil, these kind of numbers, but it's, let's say, a kind of multi-indicator biophysical rationing protocol.
Yeah, I hear that. I hear that. I guess that other key step, though, is, of course, the prioritization of, you know, how do these different activities contribute to the satisfaction of human needs, of well-being? And, you know, how can we disaggregate, thinking of sectors, for example, like, of course, it's fairly straightforward if we think of food or housing. You know, people have a right to have enough to eat and a right to shelter and clothing and so on. But of course, so much that is produced within these sectors is, the purpose is not really to create, you know, sufficient food for people to eat or housing for people to have shelter. It's actually following an altogether different motive, usually based on profit maximization or getting you know, profits largely. So how, I guess for me, that's the big clincher, is within each of these sectors, these provisioning systems, as we could think of them, to what extent are we actually provisioning the satisfaction of human needs, and to what extent are we getting, you know, is there an extraction, an appropriation of the resources being transformed into accumulation of the elite? So that's where my thinking is going, at least. And I'm not sure if well, that's what I'd like to think a little bit more in terms of actually developing a framework that can start teasing out those appropriating versus provisioning types of questions. So we are nearing the end of our time. We're at the end of our time, actually. I am well, I should apologize to everyone who is asking questions in the Q&A and in the chat. We are not able to reach all of them. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you very much to Timothée for sharing this time together with me. And we are now about to, you're all invited to join the next closing session of the Global Connections, which is coming up right after this, where people will be coming in, dialing in from all over. And I think that's where we will see each other next. So for now, I will thank you all once again and bid you adieu. And if you want to turn off your mute to say goodbye, I love the cacophony of sounds as you do it. So thank you, Timothée, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Ciao.